Charlie Murphy's cooking Johnsonville brats. Have you heard?
I don't know what the hell you're talking
Johnsonville
about.
brats.
Do you think
Charlie Murphy's cooking Johnsonville brats?
That ad would have ever reached past like Ohio and gotten to New York?
I'm Rob.
And I'm Artie. And welcome to Trade Splaining, a podcast that tries to make sense of international trade, business, and expat life without putting you to sleep.
In episode 80, we'll talk about the new trade policy, which is not like the old trade policy.
It has clothes on.
AI coming even for AI's jobs. How everything millennial is cool again? Probably not, actually. And the serious situation with the exchange of sausage secrets.
This maybe we should cut out.
And later on, we'll talk to Patrick McGee, the author of Apple in China, who will share how China and Apple, or Apple and China, depending on how you look at it, built a symbiotic relationship that helped build huge profits and a manufacturing powerhouse.
Basically how the sausage is made.
And we'll throw in a few points on listener feedback and sneak in a news roundup and a few jokes. So before we
find out how the sausage is made, let's
get into it.
Well then, everyone, welcome to episode number 80. That would be the atomic number of, wait for it, mercury. It's not only the metal that's somehow toxic, liquid, and still not banned, it's also the title of a Bruce Willis movie from the 90s.
Is that where he climbs up a building and it blows up?
I've actually never seen it. I just know it's called Mercury Rising.
Okay.
It's a transition metal. It's commonly known as Quicksilver, like the Marvel character. It's also unique as it's the only metal that is liquid at standard temperature and pressure, which I'm sure you'll be happy to know. It's used in thermometers, barometers, manometers. I think that's a Joe Rogan.
It's a manosphere thing.
Sphygmomanometers, float valves, mercury switches, mercury relays, fluorescent lamps.
Did I say manometers?
And other devices. It's also the number that qualifies you as an octogenarian, which is Latin for I remember when interest rates were high and when Reagan was president.
Stagflation.
Odds are you've probably fought in a war.
Stagflation.
Or on a Facebook comment thread, or both, if you're hit 80. 1980 was also the year the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics.
Like which other year would you boycott the 1980 Olympics?
Just in 1980. A rule is also named after 80. The 80-20 rule, named after Pareto, says that 80% of results come from 20% of the work. Unless you're in middle management, in which case it's 100% of the credit from 0% of the work. And I'm turning to Rob as I say this.
This doesn't include the mailbox principle, where if you get something, you send it down, then you get something from down, you send it up. You got to be a really good mailbox.
Otherwise known as macro data refinement.
Everybody thinks it's easy till everybody gets fired.
Also, if you've made it this far, well, congratulations. You clearly have excellent taste or nothing better to do, or maybe both. Either way, do us, the podcast, a favor, as well as the algorithm, and like, subscribe, and follow us wherever you get your podcasts, on whatever platform that may be that you pretend to be productive on. Also, just before we move on, little note of housekeeping. We will be taking a summer break because we are in full Euro mode now. And as the Europeans do, we're going to be taking a couple of months off. We'll be back towards the end of August with fresh new Trade Splaining episodes full of vigor and energy. Right, Rob?
Absolutely.
Wake up.
What? Hello? What? We're going to have a hot boy summer, as confirmed by the Wall Street Journal.
And we will send photos, evidence on all the social media channels.
So, folks, be sure to tune in early September after we recorded in late August for episode 81.
Now you're just managing expectations.
We're negotiating.
It's actually never coming out. So first up, a quick roundup of listener feedback. A listener recently told us that they loved catching the podcast for the first time the other day, actually. They enjoyed our discussion on the IMO while blow-drying, quote, her hair. It was great fun. There's interesting trade stuff, according to her. Then there's you, and Rob, So I want to say that's like a positive thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
Yeah. You do have kind eyes, even though no one can see them because it's an audio podcast. I think this episode is going to be a little light on the trade stuff since we did spend most of the last few weeks mainly sharing memes.
And also, we're not talking about tariffs.
No, I think there's also lots of other much more serious things going on. So we'll try to bring some levity and, of course, trade stuff for you trade wonks out there. What have you been hearing?
I think it's been a really pretty heavy week. We'll come back to that, but I think right now I need to talk about sober raves, sober tailgate parties, sober dances. So what I'm asking, and this is obviously for you, Michelle, if these things are happening, people are wearing funny outfits and so on, and they're dancing, they're staying out all night, but they're sober. How are we going to exercise bad judgment? Like, how are we going to turn an ankle? How is your generation really going to make this happen if they're not crushed?
I don't know. I think you need a new excuse in that case.
Yeah.
It's very simple. But at the same time, people have phones everywhere, so I think you just don't want to get filmed drunk or making mistakes. So that's the problem. I think that's what people have been saying.
Okay.
I don't want to get filmed doing that, so they don't do anything.
Interesting. Maybe jam the cell. So we need a jammer.
We need we need a jammer. We need a
Like the
cell jammer.
Bob Marley song?
We need a jammer.
Shame we would
Where
get
is
copyright
Bob
infringement.
Marley right now? Gen Z.
We're jamming.
We're jamming. That could bring back the house party. Okay, so the sober tailgate's on.
Yeah, as long as if you don't have phones, I'm sure people will get drunk.
Done.
That's my take.
Okay.
We're jamming. Welcome back to What Went Wrong This Week. That's the segment where we break down what's happening in the world of trade, economics, and general global weirdness. Let's start by diving into what's making the headlines and sort of raising eyebrows this week. First up, trade policy is dead. Long live whatever this is called.
That doesn't look like it used to.
No. Meet the new boss. It's not really the same
not
as
the
the
same.
old boss.
No, it's not. No.
So trade policy, as I said, isn't what it used to be. It's now tangled up in national security, climate strategy, and the occasional steel mill. So the Wall Street Journal has recently noted that the U.S.-China trade war has been evolving into a broader economic standoff, and export controls and supply chains are used as sort of foreign policy tools. Trade talks now, what they say, resemble more arms control negotiations, just with more spreadsheets and less submarines.
Mutually assured destruction looks a little different, but yeah.
That's actually what they call it when the Excel breaks down and you have to restart.
The Wi-Fi in the hotel goes out.
There's also an interesting bit in Bloomberg where they say that proposed tariffs under the second Trump administration could cost the U.S. up to 690,000 jobs, so just shy of 700 for those who are math challenged. This comes as the global allies also seem to be hedging their bets, so call it a U.S. plus one strategy, as it's unclear where the U.S. might go next, from their perspective at least. The Times also adds this unpredictability that it's pushing allies like the EU and Japan to deepen ties with one another, not necessarily as a snub, but as more of an insurance policy. Washington Post also, I think Rob will like this, it talked about carbon tariffs having gained traction as a way to address emissions-heavy imports, particularly from China. And it seems what started as a climate mechanism is now being used as more of a geopolitical tool, which is in keeping with the theme of these news segments we've chosen to highlight. And then finally, the Times again is reporting that the U.S. administration has secured a golden share in the U.S. steel deal, which was recently announced. And this basically grants veto rights over key decisions to the U.S. government. This is in particular is a notable shift. It basically goes from deregulation to direct control, particularly in strategic sectors. So it'll whether or not this becomes a sign of more things to come, or is it a one-off, remains to be seen. But it's an interesting question. What do you think about this, Rob?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. So trade policy is not what we thought it was. Negotiations are not what we thought they were. So these new, shorter, compressed negotiations are transactional. We know that, sectoral. They have other aspects, and some of them are coming through. So the UK's come through. We talked about that last time. But there's another 11 or 12 that are coming. But what is interesting is also people are starting to think, okay, with this new set of things we're talking about, can we not have a new kind of trade policy, and what does it mean? So a couple of things you mentioned I think are really interesting. So we now have arms control was about let's prevent the most catastrophic scenario. That's all arms control was about. So that's what we're doing in trade now. Let's prevent a 300% tariff. Let's prevent somebody excluding you from rare earths. Let's prevent no chips being traded. So that's kind of what this article is talking about. That's where we are now, rather than let's find win-win. That's no longer the thing. There's also this really interesting aspect of, if we're going to start thinking about these things, let's do a carbon tariff. So the tariffs are graduated based on how much carbon is in your manufacturing. The article argues that all or almost all of Chinese manufacturing is powered on coal.
Clean coal.
Clean coal, as we used to call it in West Virginia. So this is something that could be both a tariff, and that's a real beautiful word, as we know, but also a way to address imbalances in the trade system. But people have also talked about other ways to drive this. So you can drive it based on if there's overcapacity in an industry like steel, you can get together as markets and tax on the basis of what we consider to be overcapacity. So there's other ways to do this.
That's interesting. Does that become more of a subjective assessment of what constitutes overcapacity? So how do you measure if you're dumping steel, for example?
Steenblick's going to get mad at us for this one, but it's something like they've got the capacity to build enough steel to serve the market for the next 50 years tomorrow, something like that. So it's capacity that's so high that it's swamping every other global market, as an example.
Like I'm dumping dad jokes.
No, I mean, you'd have to be 1 billion people just like you also dumping dad jokes. That's like Luxembourg builds dad jokes, but nobody's worried about that.
Because there's nobody funny in Luxembourg.
Hey, right? Now we're catching on. And then we don't like socialism, but this whole golden share that the U.S. government now has in this U.S. steel deal, at least that's what we read in the New York Times, is a kind of a Trumpian way to socialism, isn't it? So now these business decisions are being determined based on a government fiat, and maybe for the greater good. Not sure about that one, but this is a really interesting.
I think it's
a global investment thing. It's foreign direct investment. It has to do with trade. Has many other aspects that we would normally expect to be governed by other things, and now the government has a one share determinant influence on this deal.
I think it's super interesting for a couple of reasons. One in particular is that it's progressive evolution that we've seen over the last, let's say, 10 years. So from consecutive administrations and just building on what the previous administration had done. We had talked about how the Biden administration was making it a bit more strategic, and now this is just the next level of that and a bit more overt. The second thing that this raises for me is that you had mentioned, I think it was Michael Froman's piece, where he was saying that the U.S. is looking more like China rather than in reverse, whereas 25 years ago, the consensus was that China would come to our side. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought maybe it was a bit provocative, but this maybe is an example of that thesis proving true.
Yeah, you're on the theme of we're all mercantilists now, right? That was the thing we were talking about a few months ago. But these things are more, I would say, numbers-driven, data-driven, have analysis element, but different ways of getting to the same thing. Not the golden share, but the other things. So trade policy is evolving pretty rapidly. Let's see what kind of instruments are actually considered to be normal ways to do trade policy.
The second thing we wanted to talk about is everyone's favorite topic these last couple of months, years, is AI. So it seems that the disruption is no longer just coming. It's actually here, and it's now gunning for white-collar jobs. There's been a number of articles recently. Bloomberg reported that Microsoft is planning thousands of job cuts, particularly among sales teams, as AI tools are now increasingly handling outreach and customer engagement by themselves, which is frightening and exciting at the same time. The Wall Street Journal also highlighted that the fact that developers are in the firing line as AI tools are getting better at writing code, the role of the human coder is being rethought. It's literally like the guy who puts the cap on top of the toothpaste at the toothpaste factory, just being replaced by a machine. Reuters is also noting that across industries, companies are reconfiguring or rethinking how work gets done. AI is no longer just replacing the repetitive tasks. It's now starting to reshape entire categories. So that was a really interesting bit. Finally, the New York Times just recently highlighted something I think is also super significant when you're looking at things from a macro level, and I think also more and more common in parts of the global economy nowadays, is in computing capacity. So wealthier nations and tech giants seem to be racing ahead in AI development. Others, at the same time, are being left behind due to a lack of data centers, chips, and in just general investment. And it's not just about who's going to be using AI, it's about who has the computing power or the infrastructure to shape what the future looks like. I think this is something we don't know the answer to, but we've seen this story played out consistently over the last, let's say, 10, 20 years, maybe longer. The ramifications for those who are left behind, I would say, will probably be profound. Whether or not this is addressed in the near future, I think remains to be seen, though. What do you think about this, Rob? It's a lot there to unpack.
We see some of the things that they've talked about. So I think it's really interesting First of all, it's interesting that Microsoft has 45,000 salespeople out of 250,000. So there's a lot of folks doing this. There were potentially economies to be had, but that these things that we thought, customer engagement and so on, can be automated, now they are. And that's an example that the FT is talking about, where there's many things people have been experimenting with, and companies who are a little bit conservative about using this stuff are now finding ways to put into practice. So one of their examples is there's an online grocery retailer who's used it to significantly reduce the time it takes to fill a grocery cart, let's say. And that has reduced the need for workers by a third or something. So this is one of those things that probably they were quite conservative at the beginning. They needed to work their way into it. But some of these are becoming more practical now. But the question, one of the other articles you mentioned, is about, is it displacement, or is it disruption, or is it actually destroying jobs? And I think that the jury is still out, right? So a lot of the early AI guys were saying, look, it's going to create more jobs, it's going to destroy other jobs, and it was a bit of a wash. And I don't think right now, from the articles that we're reading, that's 100% clear.
I try not to be too pessimistic. Well, that's difficult nowadays. So it is disrupting the nature of jobs. So coders are being replaced just because the simple parts of the coding jobs are being replaced by AI for obvious reasons. It's getting better and better. But what's more profound, I think, is the fact that the pipeline. So two things on that. It's becoming more important, not that you basically can write code, but that you can manage, or say know what prompts to use in managing AI or different AI applications to get the same outcome. That's one thing. So those types of managers will be more sought after, at least in these sort of tech fields. But the second thing, which is kind of frightening, is the fact that the talent pipeline that we see now for recent graduates, those people who would be those future managers in a couple of years, they won't receive these opportunities to start their career at some point, because you don't become a manager overnight, right? You don't develop the skills or the understanding or the capacities, the competencies to know what questions to ask without having done it first. So it's a chicken and egg thing, which for me raises lots of interesting and scary questions. So if you're a college kid graduating now and you don't have access to the same opportunities or a number of opportunities you did to get that level of experience to then become a manager and know how to use AI, as I said before, how do you get there is the question. I don't know how you square that circle. Sorry to depress you.
I don't know.
Let's ask ChatGPT.
Exactly. We don't know.
I'm laughing just to stop from crying.
We don't know. Probably it's just the way it was. People do gain experience. Maybe it's experience doing prompts or other things. But the vision of where it goes is unclear. For me, it's being even more reinforced that it's not what you do in college that's going to get you there. So you need to have multiple, people are more rounded, and college may not be a great investment at this stage.
All right. So the last thing we wanted to talk about is a country quite close to our hearts and under our feet at the moment. And that is Switzerland, who's quietly been signing big, beautiful trade deals. Wink, wink. So while it's bigger economies that seem to be playing trade chess or just eating the chess pieces, Switzerland has quietly locked in a major new agreement with the EU. So 24 heures, that's 24 hours for the non-French speakers, reports that the Swiss Federal Council has approved a wide-ranging 1,000-page framework with the EU, informally known as the bilaterals, quote unquote. I don't know who came up with that name. The deal covers everything from market access to airspace, technical regulations, and dispute mechanisms. The political debate at home continues, though. If you remember, this was a big issue quite a few years ago where there was a referendum on it, things like this. So that seemed to have been put on hold. People kind of forgot about it for obvious reasons.
It's always been an issue, but many small countries are in the same situation. Do they recognize their interdependence with the big bloc next to them, in this case the EU, which is Switzerland's biggest market and source of technology and source of people and every other good thing? So do they recognize that and realize they've got overlapping airspace, technical regulations, finance industry, water, electricity? And are they going to have 50 separate or 100 separate agreements? Or are they going to put this together in a big package? As they said, the Europeans pushed hard, but the Swiss accepted. There should be one agreement. And the issues are not about airspace and technical regulations and so on. And it's certainly not about access to the EU market from a technical standpoint, like for medical instruments and stuff, which is really critical to Swiss industry. So the political issues around, is Switzerland going to contribute to this Research Horizon program where they have to make contributions? Are they going to be subject to EU Court of Human Rights and so on? But I think it's a good example of, probably measured recognition of interdependence and an efficient way to deal with things. But people could see it easily as 1,500 pages of European overregulation.
I'm just more concerned with who called it the bilaterals. It's like, was it James Joyce fan?
It sounds like a novel.
On the shores of Lake Geneva, somebody wrote the bilaterals.
I hear you, that you don't love this. But this is like a really important thing to me, and I really want you to recognize.
It's 1,000 pages of... It's like Homer's Odyssey.
It's a little bit like that. No.
Patrick McGee is a business journalist who has written for the Financial Times since 2013, reporting from Hong Kong, Germany, and California. My old job. He led the FT's Apple coverage from 2019 to 2023 and won a San Francisco Press Club Award, which is the best tech article for a newspaper, 2023 for his deep dive into Apple's HR problems. His FT magazine cover article, Inside Peloton's Epic Run of Bungled Calls and Bad Luck, received an honorable mention from SABW's Best in Business Awards in 2022.
Patrick's focus over the past decade has been on Apple, digital advertising, robotaxis, electric vehicles, the Volkswagen diesel scandal, and connected fitness, such as Peloton. Previously, he was a Bond reporter at the Wall Street Journal in New York.
Patrick, thanks for joining us on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. Before we dive into the book, which I recommend everyone reads, why don't we have you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you end up working in this field in journalism, particularly in tech, and how did you end up in supply chains of all places?
So Steve Jobs used to say that you can only connect the dots backwards, and that's when your life makes sense. And so the book for me was the culmination of 10 years at the Financial Times, where I spent 3 in Hong Kong, specifically during the years when what we called the Umbrella Revolution. So this was like Hong Kong protesters, 10 years younger than me, 15 years younger than me, clamoring for Hong Kong independence, basically, or even just Hong Kong rights. And then I spent 3 years covering the Volkswagen scandal and living in Frankfurt, sort of walking in and out of supply chain factories, right? A lot of automotive companies in Germany. And then 4 years covering Apple, right? So if you couple those 3 things together, supply chains, China, and Apple, in a sense, you get the basis for my book.
So before we dive into the details, what's one key takeaway from your work that listeners or readers of your book should come away with? What's the thing you learned most?
I could take that in so many different directions. I mean, one would just be that we've covered Apple wrong the last 25 years. They are a manufacturing company. They just don't do any of the manufacturing. But obviously, they're a hardware company. Obviously, they have fantastic engineers. And yet we're so enamored by the design and the software and the features that we just haven't asked any of the questions that, frankly, Apple doesn't want you to ask, which is how are they actually made, right? It's the old quip about the sausage, right? No one wants to know how the sausage gets made. My book is basically just that for the iPhone.
People have talked about the iPhone, and building on what you said, as sort of a case study in globalization. So you've said, I think, that the iPhone is the most successful globalized product in history. Can you walk us through sort of how we ended up in a place where Apple is basically stuck between a rock and a hard place?
So the iPhone alone had achieved more than $2 trillion of revenue. It is by far the most successful consumer product ever. And the story that I tell, or maybe I should distinguish, when I pitched the book, it was really about how Apple had become dependent on China. So that this is where the subtitle comes from, right? The idea that they're captured by China. There is no place else on the planet that matches China's ability to scale, certainly not in those qualities and certainly not at that price. So if you want to build the iPhone someplace else, good luck. The nuance that really came out of speaking to more than 200 people, a lot of them from Apple operations, a lot of them had never spoken to a journalist before, is that Apple didn't become dependent on capabilities it discovered in China. It became dependent on capabilities it created there. And the sort of novel understanding that I give the reader is that after industrial design, the team led by Johnny Ive through the golden age of we're going to make the iPod unapologetically white on the front with a chrome back and a spinning wheel. After that is product design. These are the geniuses who sort of figure out how to actually, work with the dimensions given to them by Ive, and then figure out how all these circuit boards and electronics assembly is going to be done within the phone. And then the third group, which had never really been written about, is called MD, or manufacturing design. And these are a team of engineers who would go over to Asia in general, and then later, much more specifically, to hundreds of factories across China to really build the competencies in China. So they would train, audit, supervise, and install millions of dollars worth of machinery, later hundreds of millions of dollars worth of machinery, later billions of dollars worth of machinery, to really have such an impact on these factories that I literally compare it to a nation-building effort. That will sound a little bit insane when I say it with a 90-second soundbite, but it will not be insane to any reader who gets more than 200 pages into when the book has a chapter called A Marshall Plan for China. Because by that point, you understand that Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive had this just maniacal obsessiveness over details. That's something that we sort of already know, but we haven't made the next mental leap of what does it mean to transfer that mentality into hundreds of factories across China who really didn't have a background doing quality products. I mean, Apple plays this really transformative role, teaching them how to manufacture at the highest yield possible and have a zero tolerance for defects culture. And the result of that isn't just Apple is a $3 trillion company with amazing products and $400 billion of revenue. The result of that is Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi had 55% market share of the smartphone industry. The result of that is China now dominates in electric vehicles, which after all is a smartphone on wheels. So Apple has this enormous impact on the country. And the two figures that sort of exemplify this, if you think I'm saying something that sounds unhinged, is the number of workers Apple has trained in its supply chain since 2008 is 28 million. That's larger than the labor force of California. And when they did their own supply chain study in 2015, they realized they were investing $55 billion across hundreds of factories in China. And that's basically the message that they deliver to get out of a bind when Xi Jinping is is selected as president and really doesn't see Apple's value. And so there's the political message that Apple comes up with, which is you have no idea how much we're contributing to your country.
Yes, some of the other numbers mentioned are pretty crazy in terms of the billions per year that Apple spends on just training. So sort of like a finishing school for advanced manufacturing workers. Talk us through very quickly a little bit, what like the top line figures, the ones that sort of would stand out the most.
So the CHIPS Act, which is Joe Biden's flagship policy to bring chip fabrication back to America, it was called a once in a generation investment by the Commerce Secretary. That's $52 billion over 4 years. So Apple is doing more than a CHIPS Act every single year for the last decade in China. I mean, that alone is astonishing. The reason I had to even compare it to something like the CHIPS Act is that I could not find any corporate investment that was anywhere close to what Apple was spending. So for instance, all corporate or private investment from Canada and the United States into Mexico from the signing of NAFTA in 1993 to 2020 adds up to some $250 billion. So Apple, in May 2016, pledges to invest more than that just in China for a 5-year period. So once you realize that there's no corporate equivalent, you start looking at government efforts. And I thought it was fanciful to look at something like the Marshall Plan. I believed that I might find that it was a heavy fraction or something of the Marshall Plan. And instead, you take Marshall Plan spending, right? This is America sort of playing a savior role for Europe, if you will, 16 countries. And they spend in 2015 $131 billion. So half what Apple pledged in a 5-year period in a single country rather than 16. And rather than it being broad spending with things like food aid, agricultural revival, building ports, building highways, this is the advanced electronics industry, the thing that Xi Jinping desires the most. And this is where I come up with the argument that Apple unwittingly, perhaps, becomes the largest supporter of Made in China 2025, an ambitious plan for Beijing to sever China from the West and become self-sufficient in robotics, automation, and electronics.
So I think the figures are extremely impressive, and they show the level of investment. And I'm sure there are waves of other types of investment that have gone into China. Now, the question I guess that we have would be, this was kind of how globalization was meant to work at a certain point. And we know China is a great, let's say, example of bringing people out of poverty, of development. So it's one of those that's helped us make some of the Millennium Development Goal numbers. Is it just that now geopolitics have changed, and that's why we're now worried about what could otherwise be seen as an amazing, kind of success story of building, let's say, capabilities in a developing country that's led to a lot of prosperity?
So all of that's true. The poverty alleviation in China is a net good, something that should be cheered. And I don't have any villains in the story. It very much is a neutral, how it happened narrative. The trouble is that In the early 2000s, nobody should blame Apple for moving into China. It was supposed to be the next great democracy. And America had really played a sort of starring role alleviating poverty and helping countries become thriving democracies after World War II. The big examples, of course, being Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, which is ethnically Chinese, and South Korea. And we tried to do the same thing in China. So I'm all for that. I think that sounds great. I'm very much pro the integrationist world, what you might call Pax Americana. The trouble is Xi Jinping takes China in a totally different direction. And China is so large that it doesn't so much participate in the integrationist world. It seeks to subsume it. That's the difference. And so you could just say, you don't have to be so anti-China. This isn't such a big deal. We've had a golden age where Silicon Valley works on the software, maybe the AI, and China does the hardware. Yeah, that's true. But you're gambling on things working out. And the trusted figure is Xi Jinping, who's a dictator for life. That seems to be quite the gamble. So I would distinguish between the good that has come out of investing in China and the complete consolidation whereby Apple really has no plan B. I mean, we could talk about India, we could talk about America, but there is no plan B for Apple's supply chain. There's one country where they've done a quarter century worth of nation building like investment. And Supply Chain 101 will tell you immediately, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. If that basket becomes a surveillance state, I think you have a deeper problem.
So I guess you've answered my question, which was going to be whether Apple is more reliant on China or China is more reliant on Apple at this stage. But since I said it, what would be your conclusion after your book?
I really don't think Apple has so much to teach China anymore. Certainly not in smartphones, in part just because the smartphone is a pretty saturated product. People who want a smartphone own a smartphone at this point. And, the changes to the iPhone over the last 5 years are pretty small. There's almost no changes to the design. So it really just is that the batteries are a little bit better, the cameras take better pictures, and the chips are faster. And those are, of course, made out of Taiwan. That is essentially it. It's not as though if I've got an iPhone 16 and you've got an iPhone 8, we're using different apps, right? We're still using Spotify and Audible and Uber, etc. So the experience isn't as revolutionarily different as it used to be in the first, 10 years of the iPhone, when Johnny Ive, who's no longer at the company, was really upending the design. And I think that matters because if China decides to cancel Apple's export license, which I'm not saying is a likely event, but let's just do it as a thought experiment, there is no iPhone. There is no place on the planet to just start rebuilding the product. And I don't think people understand just how complex the supply chain is. So I've got some internal documents that talk about, it's an Excel file essentially, that has 1,700 facilities that are working on building different iPhone and Mac components, and then the assembly. And that number has increasingly become Chinese at the expense of US multinationals or Korean or Taiwanese multinationals operating in China, because Apple has been they traditionally chased quality, but they've been chasing price and political points to some degree, whereby the Taiwanese in particular, like Foxconn, are getting squeezed out in favor of companies that are maybe not on the lips of your average American listener, but Luxshare, Goretech, BYD, and Wingtech. These are assembly giants in China that count Apple as their largest clients. And Apple has so much reason to work with them. For starters, they hire like mad from places like Foxconn so that they can say, this is how many people we have with Apple experience, right? But they also offer lower margins. And they offer lower margins for reasons that I think we're sort of asleep at the wheel to, which is that China's version of capitalism, which is ridiculously efficient and daunting in certain respects, doesn't prioritize shareholders the way Western capitalism does. And so they can operate on lower margins because there's a directive from the state to move up the value chain, because Xi Jinping wants to prioritize indigenous innovation and made in China 2025, as I already stated. So you look at certain industries like solar panels. China doesn't have any companies that are earning 30% doing solar panels, but in the aggregate, these companies doing solar panels have more than 95% market share. Good luck making solar panels that are competitive with China. And I think that's the same thing that's playing out in smartphones, same thing playing out in electric vehicles and so forth. And so China can be so successful at certain things that they effectively deindustrialize all trading rivals. That is quite a daunting prospect, and Apple has helped enable it. And Apple has done so for the simple reason that they haven't sold any more smartphones each year than 2015. That was the peak year. but they can make more money from smartphones if they raise the cost and they raise the margins. And they raise their margins by working with lower cost companies in China. So it works as a sort of shareholder first capitalist, but it doesn't really work in terms of all our rivals, our rival nations that are participating in what was once called globalization, right? I don't think of my story as a story of globalization. It's a story of Chinification. And what IBM PC in 1981 did for electronics globalization, the iPhone has done for...
So we talk a lot about, trade policy right now is in a time of evolution. The idea of free trade, low tariffs, common standards is kind of going away. We've got a new kind of aggressive transactional situation. We've got a new situation which is more integrated, or at least more visibly integrated with geopolitics. So do you think there's somehow a lesson learned here for those of us who are sitting in Geneva thinking, we've got a rules-based system, we want trade to work well, we want it to do the right things. And when I say we, I guess it's good maybe to disaggregate. So we got governments in the West, we've got the government of China, we've got governments in other places like Vietnam, India, and so on, who are receiving the manufacturing assets that are radiating out of China. I don't know how to summarize that, but do you have anything we should take away from this?
There's a lot to unpack there. Look, I think the Chinese are really, really good at industrial policy, at setting out a 5-year plan and sticking to it. And especially in sort of having there is a top-down system. It is communism. So in other words, when we think of bureaucrats in the West, we're basically thinking about people that stop growth for various reasons, right? They're the ones putting up roadblocks saying you can't build here. This is someone's community. You can't stop. You can't do this for environmental reasons, right? They're just holding you back. In China, you often had bureaucrats that were enabling growth. They were more like a venture capitalist that takes a seat on the board, has growth as their sort of North Star, and would clear the hurdles, get things done in order to build things more quickly. I guess where that leaves you, and this is probably above my pay grade, is that when we're doing trade deals with countries, we probably need to have stronger environmental protections, stronger protection of worker rights, because otherwise he with the least rights, he with the least environmental protection wins. I mean, that is, in essence, if you're being cynical, sort of the story of China's rise over the last 20 years.
Require sort of collective action. They talk about things like if a country like China has so much capacity that they're able to own whole markets, that becomes something that collectively the other economies can get together and try to compensate for in trade and tariff policy. And that may be, one thing. The difficulty comes around getting everybody to work together. But I guess also my question is, are there some elements of Chinese industrial policy which we can adopt? For instance, some say, can't we have Chinese companies come and I would say, Western countries or other countries force them into or incentivize them into technology transfer agreements?
Capitalism with Chinese characteristics.
But look, I mean, I would welcome with open arms BYD opening a factory in Alabama and creating electric vehicles there, right? Like we have this asymmetric investment where so many companies, big tech companies that are anyone involved in hardware is basically building in China. But how many Chinese companies are investing in America or in Switzerland? Not many. It's sort of a one-way road. And that's intentional on the part of China. And, if we're having trade negotiations, I would love to see that flipped around a little bit. There's this quote I like that says, where commerce doesn't cross borders, armies do. So there's a sense that the more trade we have, the more mutual investment we have, the better things would be. Now, you have to draw the line. If you view Huawei as like a state asset rather than a real company, which I think is sort of open to question, then yeah, maybe you don't want their factories. Maybe you don't want, spyware in the country. I mean, there would have to be a whole host of precautions to take. But on the whole, in the same way that the Toyota I own was built in America because Toyota's had factories now in America for, decades, going back to 1985, I think, it would be great if there was more Chinese factories, Chinese investment, and sort of cross, exchange between the countries rather than just American investment, just European investment in China.
There's been lots of talk about decoupling. So we're a trade podcast, obviously. We talk a lot about decoupling, nearshoring, reshoring, things like that over the past couple of years, almost ad nauseum. Based on what you learned in this book and the conclusions you came to, how feasible is that for a company like Apple to say sort of pick up and, we'll move some of our production to India in the off chance, or maybe let's call it a non-0% chance that tariffs increase by X amount tomorrow? let's say diversification at a minimum, maybe decoupling would probably be a bit difficult, most would admit.
Total fantasy. And even if it were theoretically possible, Apple has a $70 billion business in China. There are only about 12 organizations in the world that have more than $10 billion of revenue in China, and Apple tops the list at 7 times that. They're not going to say farewell to that business anytime soon. The trouble is that technology transfer is really important to China, and they know the lesson of corporations chasing labor. They know that the jobs will get lost if they lose that. In other words, Beijing wants technology transfer to be a one-way gate. The information comes in, it does not leave. So since I submitted the manuscript before it got published, we've seen moves where Beijing has blocked visas from Chinese people that would go to India to set up production lines, right? The people that have the experiential know-how. And for India to do that, you would also need machinery coming from China, and Beijing has blocked that as well. So they see the writing on the wall that quality manufacturing sort of goes from America at the end of World War II over to Japan and then to South Korea and Taiwan, its former colonies. And then because there's a shared language between Taiwan and China, it goes that direction, right? Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn, is a major character in the book. And so the next evolution really would be to a place like, Vietnam to some degree, but it's not big enough. If you're talking apparel, it's going to places like Bangladesh. But if you're talking high-tech electronics, the next place logically is India. But Beijing knows that better than I do, and so they're not allowing it.
I can tell it's not your first interview, Patrick.
Yeah.
Cool. So, Patrick, thanks again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. The book, the way you described it, the way you talk about it, I can tell you put your heart into it, and that really comes out. And I suggest all listeners also pick it up when they can. I wish you best of luck in the future, and hope to have you on again for your next book.
Thanks so much.
So, Artie, this brings us to our next segment. This is where TS correspondent Michelle talks to us about the vibe shift. Michelle, has globalization finally died?
So globalization, I honestly don't know, but I do know that Ticketmaster is having a huge effect on what we're buying right now. So the All-American Rejects, you might remember them.
I remember them.
I guess millennials remember them. Well, they're going on a house party tour. Yes, I said house party, as in
Okay.
your friend's cousin's backyard with a folding table and some crappy Bluetooth speaker. Except this time there's a live band, and not just any band, the All-American Rejects. Well, why not? Between a recession that won't admit it's a recession, World War III, that's trending every other Tuesday, and Ticketmaster doing some kind of cartel stuff with their tickets, maybe this is the only thing that makes sense. Stadium tours are for billionaires and nostalgia. House parties are for the rest of us. It's not just cheaper, it's intimate, chaotic, and very low stakes because you can basically just show up to the concert.
Yeah, and put $1 in a cardboard box and get a beer out of the thing.
Sign me up.
Yeah, I don't know if...
Is it that kind of house party?
So, yeah, they've done some rent parties, but apparently they don't take any of the money that they get from that. So basically you can pay rent with the All-American Rejects.
How do they eat?
They probably have like streams and stuff. I don't think they're making that much money out of this house party tour.
So they probably can't pay for a lawyer to sue us if we use their music on this episode.
Yeah, I think they still have streams. I think everybody who's ever broken up listens to Gives You Hell.
Plus, the house party thing is not where the revenue is, but it's a good hook, potentially.
It is. They're getting a ton of advertising out of that. People filming them. Because if you don't have to pay, you might as well film the whole gig. And you're right in front of them.
Let me just ask you, because it does sound like it could be lucrative or not. So are we talking about a recession indicator here?
I think it's a recession indicator for sure, because nobody can afford tickets anymore. So anyway, the world is ending and the All-American Rejects are playing in your backyard.
That brings us to our next segment. This is the segment where we identify and thank our advertisers. So with all this advertising we've been doing over the last 80 episodes, we must be accumulating quite a revenue. So who do we have to thank amongst our advertisers this month?
So I think the biggest advertiser we have is PocketHose.com.
Pocket Hose, everybody knows them.
Of course.
But
So-
to hose you down with deals on Pocket Hose. Buy 2, get 5.
So tell us about this great product. What's Pocket Hose?
It looks like it's a hose that you can fit in your pocket.
It's literally, it is what it says it is. After I heard about this great product, I went to the website and they talk about their toughest, smartest, most advanced hose yet.
Yes.
So we recommend this as a great product.
The number one expanding hose in the world.
So here we are going to our next segment. Now we're entering This Week in Local News. You wouldn't believe this was true unless you lived in Geneva or really
Globally.
anywhere else. So the first story, we really need you to come in here, Artie. In the theater of, in my view, the truly absurd, millennial stuff has now somehow come back around to truly cool for the Gen Zs, as they're called.
And everything is right in the world.
The New York Times talks about Gen Z, and I'm quoting here, girlies watching Sex and the City, Facebook albums of blurry photos out of a night out, etc. So these are the things that are coming back.
Changing your MySpace.
I feel like that was last year.
I'm just happy that millennials are finally getting their moment in the sun.
So here, we got one millennial with us, one Gen Z with us, as we call them here in Europe.
Yeah.
So here are the trends. Big hair.
Got it.
Yeah, that's Sabrina
It's in.
Carpenter.
Check.
Yeah.
It's in. Sex and the City, we already talked about. Then there's something called JNCO jeans. What is that?
Oh, jeans.
Do
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
what that
The
is?
like big jeans.
And finally, Pokemon. It's back, folks.
Those nerds who kept the Pokemon cards with them
Yeah,
for 20
yeah.
years, they're all
back.
Bitcoin millionaires now.
Okay,
they
they're
made more money
zillionaires.
with Bitcoin. I'm particularly excited to have the half beanie on your head, but not really on look to come back. That's going to be cool. I'm guilty of that.
Okay,
Just
in the
like-
winter.
I'm really excited to have like people change their MySpace music to tell everyone what like they're feeling at that moment.
Ew.
They're depressed. So if the
Ew.
All American Rejects comes on, you know I've had a bad day.
And then we, of course, have our segment about why did planes turn around this week. There were a lot of planes turning around. We've got one flight that was deemed too large to land in Italy. Did you want to speak to that?
Here's a
Artie?
hint. It was an American flight.
We've got another one of the planes flooded mid-flight due to restroom leak.
We've all been there.
Is it? I remember
we?
one half of.
Haven't we?
I remember half of the plane was out with the.
You know, like,
Somebody would be like, "You clogged up half the plane, bro."
it's going to be the sequel to that Samuel L. Jackson movie. Instead of snakes on the plane.
We got the last thing, which I think we do need to talk about. This is a trade dispute. Minnesota's Hormel, if you're familiar with this, is the guys that brought you Spam, and Wisconsin's Johnsonville, both sausage makers, are now in a legal dispute. Apparently, somebody at Johnsonville was sending stolen sausage secrets, and this is in the story, to Hormel.
You never tell
Don't do
anybody
this.
how the sausage is
You
made.
do never tell
You
them.
never talk about how the sausage is made. Everyone knows that.
So we all know this has got to be punished harshly. Well, folks, that about wraps up episode 80, brought to you by Millennial Cool,
Hashtag me.
the new trade policy, and airplanes turning around for various reasons. And don't forget sausage secrets. We also want to thank Patrick McGee for joining us to talk about his latest book, Apple in China. We also want to thank our executive producer, Michelle Ogeen, as well as Armina Sanani, for highlighting the vibe shift, as well as helping to produce this and every Trade Splaining episode.
That's right. You've laughed. You've learned. You've probably also Googled what a tariff is. Now do the right thing and like, subscribe, and follow us, because you will miss 100% of the trade podcast you don't listen to. Wayne Gretzky said that. So don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Trade Splaining, or on Instagram at trade.splaining, or email us your questions, comments the old-fashioned way at trade.splaining@gmail.com. Once again, that's trade.splaining@gmail.com. So see you next time. We'll be back with more hot takes, cold facts, and especially lukewarm metaphors.
And most importantly, folks, remember to listen responsibly.